On the night of the October Revolution, the status of the Bolshevik comrades underwent a massive transformation, the day before they were the country's most wanted fugitives. But today, they had become the leaders of this country. After the initial joy and excitement, they realized they had walked into uncharted territory for the communist movement. Never before in history had a proletarian regime like theirs controlled such vast territory, population, and resources. It was unprecedented. This meant they could no longer find answers in the history books. They had to create their own history. When the October Revolution broke out, in 1917, the First World War was still going on for the Russian soldiers on the front lines. This year was undoubtedly a chaotic one. At the start of 1917, they were still fighting for the Tsar. They could barely hold back the German army's attacks. And as they retreated in defeat, the February Revolution broke out back home. The people commanding them were replaced by the bourgeois provisional government. This provisional government ordered them to launch a pointless offensive against the Germans. The result was predictable. They lost again, but the short-lived provisional government only lasted for a few months before being overthrown by the proletariat. By the winter of 1917, when the Bolsheviks took over this army, they were no longer able to hold off the German offensive. Reports from the front reached Lenin, and he decided to sue for peace, to pull out of this war between imperialist powers, to save the newborn Soviet regime. But suing for peace meant ceding territory and paying reparations. This sparked a massive controversy within the party. The majority, led by Bukharin, were staunchly opposed to making peace. Model. They advocated for fighting the Germans to the bitter end, even if it meant negative consequences for the Soviet regime. They believed that the proletariat should never at any time compromise with imperialism. It was a symbol of weakness, a betrayal of the world revolution. If the Soviet regime was destroyed while resisting the German invasion, then so be it. Such a destruction would inspire the rest of the world's proletariat to rise up in revolt. This was a very idealistic and doctrinaire way of thinking. But Stalin was much more of a realist. He supported Lenin. He wasn't sure if a world revolution would even happen, but the Russian Revolution had already happened. They had to protect the gains of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky himself proposed a third option. No war, no peace. He proposed a ceasefire, but without signing a treaty with the Germans, just stalling for time, waiting for a potential turning point. That turning point was the outbreak of revolution in Germany. The Soviet government held a vote. 32 people supported Bukharin. 16 supported Trotsky. The number supporting Lenin was the smallest, only 15 people. Lenin's proposal failed to pass, but he was convinced he was right. Before Trotsky went to negotiate with the Germans, Lenin made a deal with him. If the Germans delivered a final ultimatum, he was to accept the treaty. And sure enough, that's exactly what the Germans did. They demanded Poland, Lithuania, parts of Estonia, all of Latvia and Belarus, as well as reparations of 3 billion rubles. Otherwise, the German army would resume its attack. Lenin telegraphed Trotsky telling him to accept all of the Germans' conditions. But Trotsky didn't do it. He refused to sign. Trotsky's decision was based on two considerations. First, by not giving in to the ultimatum and waiting until they were beaten by Germany with no other choice before signing. They thought this attitude could win over their own people and the working classes in other countries, gaining more of their understanding and support. Second, if the German government continued the war, it might ignite anti-war sentiment back home in Germany, becoming the spark for a revolution. It was a good idea, but the time for a German revolution just hadn't arrived yet. The German army resumed its attack and was completely unstoppable. The Bolsheviks were out of time. They went back to the negotiating table, but this time they were facing an even harsher treaty. Lenin and Stalin were tired of the arguments. They both wanted to get a treaty signed as soon as possible to get their proposal passed. Stalin grimly pointed out Soviet Russia's situation. There was no other option either, get some breathing room, or face the failure of the revolution. Lenin went even further, threatening to resign. In the end, this guy conceded. He shifted his support to Lenin. The treaty was finally signed. However, the price was devastating for Soviet Russia. It lost 1,260,000 square kilometers of land, 34% of its population, 54% of its industry, 73% of its iron ore, and 75% of its coal mines. The Tsarist-era noble officers and capitalists now had a perfect reason to oppose the Bolsheviks' patriotism and nationalism. They accused the Bolsheviks of selling out the country's and the people's interests, calling them traitors who had shamefully surrendered. This helped them get more support when they formed the White Army and launched the Civil War. The other Allied powers from World War I, who had been on the same side as Russia, were also furious about the treaty. Germany had always been fighting a two-front war, but now Russia had unilaterally pulled out of the conflict. This meant Germany could pull its troops from the Eastern Front to focus all its power against the British and French on the Western Front. However, they were also worried about the communist revolution, spreading from Russia to the rest of the world. So they decided to support the White Army, intervening in the Russian Civil War to extinguish the flames of revolution. The positive effects, however, cannot be ignored. If it weren't for this treaty, the country later known as the Soviet Union might never have existed. At one point, German forces had advanced to the south of St. Petersburg. After signing the treaty with the German government, they even had to move the capital to Moscow. Faced with such a grim situation, Lenin, Stalin, and their faction had a very clear line of thought. Their priority was to trade space for time. As long as the regime survived, as long as they were still standing, there was always hope. But if they were wiped out, there would be nothing left. What happened next proved their judgment was correct. Just 8 months later, Germany lost World War I. The government collapsed and the treaty was nullified. Soviet Russia reclaimed some of the lost territory. Most of the remaining lost land didn't become German territory, but instead became independent nations. And then 21 years later, during World War II, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, swallowed them all up. But that's all a story for another time. For now, let's get back to 1918. After signing the treaty and pulling out of World War I, the Soviet regime still had to face a war that it couldn't quit and couldn't afford to lose. This was the 5-year-long Russian Civil War, a war between red and white. The bourgeoisie, the royalists, the old aristocrats, the czarist officers. It was a war between all the reactionary forces that wanted to go back to the old days, and the revolutionaries who wanted to create a new era. This was Trotsky's moment to shine. He served as the chairman of the Supreme Military Council, and with astonishing speed, he established an army known as the Red Army. He appointed a large number of Tsarist-era officers to solve professional military problems, while also establishing political commissars in the army to provide ideological guidance and enforce discipline. Under his leadership, the Red Army, composed of workers and peasants, gradually grew into an indestructible force, while Trotsky shuttled back and forth between the various fronts. Commanding the army, Stalin was sent to Tsaritsyn to secure the grain supply. Traveling with him was his secretary Nadezhda, who would become his wife. 11 years after his first wife passed away, Stalin finally walked down the aisle once again. Their destination, Tsaritsyn, was a strategic location and a major transportation hub. Grain from the south was continuously sent to Moscow through Tsaritsyn. Stalin's job was to turn this trickle of grain into a raging torrent. In Tsaritsyn, he took complete control, ruthlessly suppressed White Army forces, tightened discipline, and established order. Voroshilov, who worked with him, later recalled, "The face of Tsaritsyn was completely transformed. Everyone felt that a strong revolutionary hand was guiding them." Facing a siege by Cossack troops, Stalin went several days without sleep, calmly directing the Red Army's defense. In the end, he successfully held Tsaritsyn. Little did Stalin know that 24 years later, he would have to defend this city once again. By then, Tsaritsyn had a new name, Stalingrad. During the rest of the Russian Civil War, Stalin was moved around like a firefighter, sent all over the country to handle various thorny issues. In St. Petersburg, he suppressed rebellions and repelled Yudench's large army. On the southern front, he formed the 1st Cavalry Army. I just need to read out the names of a few officers from this army, and you'll understand. You'll see what a legendary army this was. Regiment Commander Zhukov, Division Commanders Timoshenko and Rokossovsky, Chief of Artillery Kulik, Political Commissar Voroshilov, and Army Commander Budyonny. These 6 future marshals of the Soviet Union were all serving in this one army at the time. This legendary army defeated the once unstoppable White Army General Denikin and neutralized the White Army's threat to Moscow. Just when the situation was starting to turn in the Red Army's favor, Poland suddenly entered the war. Poland wanted to take advantage of the Russian Civil War to expand its territory. The Allied powers also wanted to after the White Army's cause was lost. Back a new force to continue fighting the Soviet regime. The two sides hit it off immediately. The Allied powers provided the money and Poland provided the manpower. In February of 1919, Poland invaded Soviet Russia. The Polish-Soviet War broke out. The Polish army had the upper hand at first, even capturing Kiev at one point. But after the Red Army regrouped, they were counterattacked by the Red Army all the way and pushed back into Polish territory. As for whether to cross the border and continue the attack on Poland, the Soviet high command was divided. Stalin and Trotsky were both against attacking Poland. They argued that the Red Army was already exhausted, and continuing the offensive would overextend the supply lines. The nature of the war would also change from self-defense to an invasion, but Lenin had other ideas. He was thinking about world revolution. In the blueprint envisioned by the world revolution, all the proletarians of the world would unite to overthrow the bourgeoisie together. The proletariat that seized power first would help other still oppressed proletarians achieve liberation. A revolutionary storm would sweep the globe, planting the red flag all over the world. the class struggle would never cease until the very last. Capitalist country had also taken the path of communism. When the Red Army reached the Soviet-Polish border, Lenin and model, many felt they were incredibly close to this dream. They wanted to press their advantage, take Warsaw and liberate Poland. From there, they could enter Germany and support the German Revolution. If even Germany became a communist state, then what could possibly stop them? Next would be England and France. The entire world would be submerged by a red tide. The Bolsheviks found this dream impossible to resist. They launched their attack on Poland. The Battle of Warsaw had begun. However, they soon discovered that there was a huge gap between their ideals and reality. Only when all capitalist countries had reached their end, when class conflict had come to far outweigh national conflict, and when all proletarians were united by a strong spirit of internationalism, could a world revolution truly be achieved? But as the Red Army advanced on Poland, they were disappointed to find that the Polish workers, peasants, and soldiers didn't side with their Russian proletarian brothers. Instead, they were inspired by nationalism and patriotism and rallied around the Polish rulers. And really, this was a perfectly normal reaction. The Poles had every reason to be suspicious of the Russians. Were they there to invade them or to liberate them? If the Red Army occupied Poland and a Polish proletarian regime was established with Russian help, would that regime truly be independent and autonomous? Would the Polish and Russian communist parties be equals? These same questions would come up time and time again later in the Soviet era, among the other Soviet republics, becoming a recurring point of contention. On one side, you had the fierce resistance of the Poles. On the other, the Red Army ran into a series of setbacks. First of all, their radio encryption was broken by the Poles. This meant the Poles knew the Red Army's battle plans like the back of their hand and could set traps specifically for them. As the commander of the Red Army's Western Front, Tukhachevsky misjudged where the main Polish forces were located. He ignored the fact that Polish reinforcements had arrived while the Red Army was severely depleted and chose to storm Warsaw, leading to disastrous consequences. Stalin also bore some responsibility for the defeat. They failed to coordinate with the 1st Cavalry Army to provide timely support for Tukhachevsky. This series of blunders ultimately led to the Red Army's defeat at Warsaw. As a result, Poland was also too exhausted to continue fighting and had to agree to a truce along the river. But Stalin never forgot Poland's invasion. 18 years later, during World War II, he partitioned Poland and orchestrated the Katyn massacre, showing the Polish people his cold and ruthless side. After the Polish-Soviet War ended, the Red Army refocused its attention on the remaining White Army forces within the country. The White Army initially had many advantages over the Red Army. They had more professional soldiers, and they also had economic and military aid from foreign countries. But those things are never the deciding factor. The key to victory is winning the hearts of the people. So what were the White Army's policies? They restored Tsarist laws and recognized private land ownership, giving the land back to the landlords instead of the peasants. They were also notorious for looting from the common people. Denikin later recalled, violence and plunder were rampant on every battlefield of the Civil War. After a victory, White Army soldiers would fill entire train cars with their loot. Even though the White Army had the most brilliant officers and the finest weapons, they struggled to replenish even the smallest losses after each battle. Meanwhile, the Red Army, despite being hungry, tired, and poorly equipped, just kept growing its ranks. The very peasants and workers who had been looted and oppressed by the Whites became new Red Army soldiers. Even White Army officers themselves had to admit, the people are not on our side. The peasants don't trust us. Denikin and Kolchak's powerful armies were destroyed by the mass warfare that relentlessly flared up in the rear. On October 25, 1922, the last of the White Army was wiped out. The Red Army had won this nation-building war. 2 months later, at the First Soviet Congress of People's Deputies, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially founded. This country, known as the Soviet Union, had arrived on the world stage. It was destined to change the world. These 5 years after the October Revolution deeply influenced Stalin. From Germany to Austria to Hungary, he witnessed how the wave of European communism rose and then fell. Outside of Russia, all of the communist revolutions in European countries had failed. The Red Army's long march also came to a halt before the walls of Warsaw. This made Stalin doubt the future of the world revolution. He realized that in many countries capitalism was still very much alive force, and the success of the October Revolution was a lucky rare event. Instead of constantly trying to export the revolution, Stalin began to focus more on building up his own country. He eventually proposed the theory of socialism in one country. He believed that socialism could first be successfully built within a single nation. This was in stark contrast to Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. which laid the groundwork for the conflict between the two men later on. Stalin's centralizing and dictatorial tendencies also grew stronger. He never forgot that when they signed the treaty with Germany, the one who got the most support was Bukharin. The truth isn't always in the hands of the majority. If they had actually gone with the results of the vote, they would all be dead by now. But if they had been able to go with his and Lenin's point of view and signed during the first round of talks, the terms of the treaty would have been more favorable. Stalin was tired of the arguments. In Tsaritsyn, he seized the highest local authority, taking control of the party government and military. As a result, the mission was a complete success. He secured the grain supply and successfully defended Tsaritsyn. This made Stalin increasingly confident that he could make better choices than most people. During these 5 years of war, Stalin also accumulated a wealth of experience in conflict and numerous connections, and all of this would help him in the upcoming power struggle to achieve victory. Lenin was already gravely ill. The Soviet Union needed a new leader. Stalin's mother once posed this question. "I don't understand. Why can't my son just share power with Trotsky?" The reason is actually quite simple. Stalin and Trotsky were fundamentally different kinds of people. One was a man of theory, the other a man of action. Before the October Revolution, Trotsky spent most of his time abroad writing articles and conducting theoretical research. Meanwhile, Stalin was always in the country engaged in underground work, doing all sorts of dirty and difficult jobs. These different experiences forged their different temperaments. Trotsky was like a polished, brilliant intellectual, while Stalin was a quiet, rugged man of the people. The two of them despised each other from their very first meeting. Trotsky's assessment of Stalin was that he was the most outstanding mediocrity in our party, and Stalin's assessment of Trotsky was that he was a beautiful but useless person. Regarding the future development of the Soviet Union, they also had completely opposing views. Neither man could accept someone he disliked, and looked down upon taking the cause to which he had devoted his life's work, and leading it in a direction he believed was wrong. This was the root of the conflict between Stalin and Trotsky. Before his death, Lenin realized the immense danger of the split between the two men, but it was too late. He no longer had the time to stop this split. After he died, he left behind a massive power vacuum, and right next to that vacuum were two powerful, high-ranking men who were like oil and water. A power struggle like this was destined to be a brutal process with a tragic ending. So for now, let's take a look at who was in the top ranks of the Soviet Union. Stalin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and Trotsky. Stalin had a clear strategy from the very beginning. He never fought alone. He always formed alliances, which was something Trotsky just didn't do. Trotsky was arrogant and brilliant, looked down on everyone else, and wasn't popular within the party. So Stalin first allied himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev, forming what was known as the Troika, and Trotsky actually helped make it happen. After Lenin died, he wrote 2 articles attacking Zinoviev and Kamenev. This pushed the two of them into an alliance with Stalin. The Troika, individually, none of them could have defeated Trotsky, but when they teamed up, things were completely different. The 3 of them launched a joint attack, publishing articles that claimed Trotskyism wasn't true Leninism. Stalin even said that the party's mission was to bury Trotskyism. Trotsky's power quickly faded, and he was removed from his post as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council. Next, Stalin found a new ally, Bukharin, and turned on his old ones, Zinoviev and Kamenev. If Trotsky had been able to side with Zinoviev and Kamenev at that point. As for Zinoviev, he still had a chance of winning, but Trotsky didn't do anything. He just watched from the sidelines. It wasn't until a year later that he allied with Zinoviev, and by this point they no longer had any power. The outcome was no surprise. Every single one of them was expelled from the party. Now only Stalin and Bukharin were left. Bukharin stood absolutely no chance against Stalin, but he was still headstrong enough to publicly confront Stalin on the issue of grain collection. Soon he was also kicked out of the Politburo. And just like that, by pitting one faction against another, Stalin defeated all the old Bolsheviks. The era of Stalin had begun. When Stalin became the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, he inherited a complete and utter mess. Starting from 1853, Russia had lost the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I. It had become a prize for the taking, the weak link in the chain of imperialism. 5 years of civil war had caused the total collapse of the economy and society. The exchange rate for the ruble to the US dollar plummeted from 2 to 1 to 1,200 to 1. Post-war industrial output dropped to 1/7 of its pre-war level. Agricultural output fell to 1/3. The Soviet Union's external situation was also grim. In 1927, Great Britain severed relations with the Soviet Union, tearing up the trade agreement. And at a 6-nation conference, they vowed to fight against the Comintern. It was in this situation, one of internal turmoil, external threats, and extreme instability, that Stalin led the Soviet Union down a path to becoming a strong nation with very unique socialist characteristics. He keenly sensed that the world order after World War I was unstable. If the Soviet Union wanted to be victorious in the next Great War, the secret was just one word: speed. He proposed that to slow down is to fall behind, and those who fall behind get beaten. We are lagging behind the developed countries. We're 50 to 100 years behind, and we need to close that gap in 10 years. Either we do this, or our enemies will crush us. Stalin said this in 1931, which was exactly 10 years before the Soviet-German War broke out in 1941. While most European politicians were still lost in a pacifist pipe dream, Stalin had already made an accurate prediction about the future and was scrambling to catch up. How? By rapidly developing heavy industry, he pointed out. Without heavy industry, we won't have any modern weapons for national defense. But Stalin still had to answer one critical question. Where was the money for industrial development going to come from? Industrialization requires huge amounts of capital. Developed capitalist countries got their initial funding by plundering their colonies. But the Soviet Union didn't have any colonies, so that route was out of the question. Stalin's answer was the price scissors policy. Under a planned economy, the government set the prices for goods. It bought agricultural products from farmers at low prices, and then sold industrial goods back to them at high prices. The profit made in the process was then funneled into industrial development. This method came at the expense of the farmers, who were of course not happy about it. Many of them refused to sell their grain to the government. Faced with this situation, Stalin pushed forward with agricultural collectivization. All farmers were forced onto collective farms, and all means of production were confiscated by the state. Farmers were allowed to leave, but only with the clothes on their backs. They couldn't take their original property or tools with them. And just like that, the farmers were tied to the collective farms, forced to accept the government's practice of buying low and selling high. Now, agricultural collectivization did have some advantages. It transformed the small-scale peasant economy into a socialist collective one. It consolidated scattered small holdings into large collective farms. And once industry was developed, it would in turn support agriculture by providing things like fertilizer and tractors, use economies of scale, and mechanization to increase agricultural productivity. Stalin's thinking, to sum it up, was this: for the sake of the country's overall development, the interests of some people had to be sacrificed first. By funneling vast resources into industry, they could achieve rapid industrialization. Only industrialization could strengthen the Soviet Union's national defense and guarantee its victory in the next World War. Industrialization would also bring about a comprehensive boost in productivity, ultimately benefiting everyone. Looking back at how history unfolded, if the Soviet Union's industrial base had been even slightly weaker, it would have been nearly impossible to stop the German army in World War II. The entire outcome of the global anti-fascist war could have been rewritten. At a crossroads in history, Stalin chose the only correct path. The achievements of the first five-year plan were extraordinary. The Soviet national income increased by 85%. Per capita, gross national product increased by 79%, and total industrial output increased by 118%. This level of growth had never been seen before in human history. The Western capitalist nations discovered with astonishment that the Soviet Union was catching up to them at an unprecedented speed. In that moment, they finally understood just how much potential the state envisioned by Marx and Lenin could truly unleash. Although the overall direction was correct, during the implementation of agricultural collectivization, the Soviet government made many mistakes. Some kulaks resisted and sabotaged the agricultural collectivization policy. Stalin then proposed the slogan of liquidating the kulaks. This meant eliminating all of them without distinction. Anyone identified as a kulak would have their property confiscated and then be exiled. And the very definition of a kulak was inaccurate. Before collectivization, kulaks made up less than 3% of the population. But in the end, the farming households that were dispossessed reached 6 to 8% of the total. Some middle class and poor peasants were also treated as kulaks. At the time, many people were terrified of being labeled as kulaks, so they slaughtered their own livestock, which in turn caused massive waste. In order to get as much capital as possible to pour into industry, the government came down incredibly hard on the peasants. The government demanded farmers turn over excessive amounts of grain for extremely low prices. Anyone who failed to turn over grain would be punished. Hoarding it could even get you shot. These policies sparked outrage among the peasants. Uprisings broke out one after another. Stalin used the army to crush the revolts and dispatched grain requisition squads into the countryside to go door-to-door searching for food. This intensified the distrust and animosity between the government and the peasants, ultimately triggering an unprecedented catastrophe, the Great Famine in Ukraine. The Great Ukrainian Famine was caused partly by the weather, but mostly by man-made factors. Ukraine was supposed to be the Soviet Union's biggest breadbasket. But during the campaign to eliminate the kulaks, 850,000 Ukrainian peasants were exiled to Siberia, which created a labor shortage in Ukraine. Add to that a continuous drought and crop yields were bound to fall. But the Soviet leadership didn't lower the grain collection quotas. Instead, they believed the shortage was because people were hoarding grain. The government mobilized grain requisition teams of over 100,000 people. To meet their quotas, these teams confiscated the peasants' last rations and even their seed grain. In the end, this led to an enormous tragedy. Millions of people starved to death. It was like a form of punishment. In 1932, the year the Great Ukrainian Famine began, Stalin also lost his wife. His wife, Nadezhda, had suffered from a serious illness since she was a child. It was a rare ossifying disease. The condition caused intense headaches. Over time, it also took a toll on her mental health. She tried to commit suicide more than once. She even went to Germany for treatment. She was treated by world-class doctors. But it was no use. Stalin loved his wife dearly, but as the leader of a country, he often had to work more than 10 hours a day. He wasn't able to give his wife the care she needed. One night at the dinner table, they got into a huge fight. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. That evening, Nadezhda used a gun to end her life. Stalin was overwhelmed with remorse and grief. At the funeral, he held onto the coffin, crying uncontrollably. Molotov remembered him saying, "I couldn't protect her." Stalin's bodyguard later recalled that for a long time, Stalin would go to the cemetery at night. He would just stand there by himself silently, one after another, smoking his pipe. Stalin stood at the pinnacle of power, and yet he made a devastating discovery. He couldn't even protect his own wife. One moment, he was the spiritual, military, and political leader of a nation, and in the blink of an eye, it all meant nothing. Fate had dealt him a cruel, mocking blow. For a moment, he just couldn't go on. He suddenly announced at a Politburo meeting that he was resigning. But his comrades understood what he was going through and didn't take him seriously. They didn't even discuss the topic. Nadezhda's death took the last bit of tenderness from Stalin's heart. He never remarried and no longer had a personal life. He poured nearly all of his time into his work with a frantic energy. A cold, stubborn Stalin emerged. He was determined to lead the Soviet Union in the direction he saw fit. Anyone who stood in his way would be mercilessly crushed. And then the Great Purge began. On December 1st, 1934, Kirov was killed. He was the party secretary of Leningrad Oblast, a Soviet, Central Politburo member, and yet right outside his own office. He was shot in the head. Kirov's bodyguard was supposed to be with him, but he didn't walk with him for the final and most crucial part of the way. And not long after it happened, that same bodyguard, on his way to be interrogated, also died in a car crash. This string of bizarre events deeply shook Stalin. Kirov wasn't just a high-ranking Soviet official. He was also a close friend of Stalin's, someone he'd been close with for many years. In all the past political struggles, he was one of Stalin's most steadfast supporters. And a man like that had just been assassinated. Stalin personally oversaw the investigation. He couldn't help but suspect a massive conspiracy was at play. But as the investigation went on, everything was given a seemingly rational explanation. The assassin claimed he had acted alone. A diary found at his home detailed how, after losing his job and struggling in life, he had slowly started down a path of revenge against society. He had decided to assassinate a major figure and go out with a bang. Kirov's bodyguard didn't follow him all the way to the end, because Kirov didn't like being followed. And the bodyguard probably figured the last stretch of the way wasn't dangerous. As for that car crash, it was just due to an unexpected mechanical failure. This baffling and mysterious case seemed to be nothing more than a series of simple events that coincidentally happened all at once. There was no way Stalin could believe that kind of story. He began to suspect everyone. The underground opposition, Trotsky, Zinoviev and their supporters, the high-level officials in the party and military who only pretended to be on his side, and even the Ministry of Internal Affairs who were part of the investigation. Every single one of them was a suspect. To this day, we still don't know the truth behind the Kirov affair. But one thing about Stalin is certain. He felt he was trapped in a conspiracy by the opposition. He decided to kill everyone who seemed like a threat. The purge began. Stalin ordered that all related cases must be investigated within 10 days, with no appeals or pleas for pardon allowed. Death sentences were to be carried out immediately. At first, the ones being arrested were genuinely part of the opposition. From them, they did indeed confiscate leaflets opposing Stalin, along with political platforms and weapons. But then Stalin completely misjudged the situation. He came to believe that the opposition was everywhere, in every department and in every social class, and that their numbers were massive. He also believed that as socialism developed, the opposition would only grow larger and more vicious. so he put Yezhov in charge of leading the anti-counter-revolutionary campaign. After that, the scale of the purge expanded rapidly and eventually spun completely out of control, becoming a massive purge that swept the entire nation. During the Great Purge, the Soviet Union's military system suffered a devastating blow. 3 out of 5 marshals were killed. 15 out of 16 army commanders were killed. 60 out of 67 corps commanders were killed. Out of the 80,000 officers in the entire Red Army, 35,000 were purged. High-level government officials were also a primary target of the purge. Of the 139 members and candidate members of the Central Committee elected at the 17th Party Congress, 98 of them were killed. Of the 7 Politburo members elected in 1923, aside from Lenin and Stalin, the other 5 were all killed. At the height of the Great Purge, in the 2 years from 1937 to 1938, a total of 680,000 people were executed across the Soviet Union. And let's not even get into whether opposing Stalin was a crime that deserved a death sentence. Among the huge number of people who were executed, there were undoubtedly many who weren't part of the opposition at all. If high-level government officials, military officers and generals, among the local leaders, if there had really been that many people opposing Stalin, then the Great Purge never could have gone so smoothly. Stalin would have been overthrown a long time ago. The Great Purge produced countless wrongful convictions and false accusations, causing tens of thousands of people to suffer unjustly. It severely damaged the rule of law in the Soviet Union, as well as its political climate and military structure, leaving scars on Soviet society that could never fully heal. It is a black mark on Stalin's life that can never be erased, and a lingering shadow over the history of the Soviet Union. By 1939, when the Great Purge ended, as far as Stalin could see, there were no voices of opposition left. From a certain point of view, he and the Soviet Union had become one and the same. His will was the will of the state. His strategy was the strategy of the state. He directed the entire country toward that one fated destined war. In that war, he would face the most powerful and most evil villain in human history. The will he had honed over the past few decades, the path he had chosen, and the faith he held on to, all of it would face its ultimate test. Right or wrong, success or failure, it would all come down to this one war. And that's everything for this video. The final episode on Stalin will be released on November 10th. Thank you all for your support.